On the evening of October 7th, 1986, Wendy Melvoin and Lisa Coleman arrived at Prince's rented Beverly Hills home. They expected a casual dinner with their bandleader. The Revolution had just finished months of sold-out shows, the band that made Purple Rain one of the biggest albums in music history. But as they sat down at the table, Prince's demeanor was different. Cold, distant. Then came the words that would end everything. "I know that you guys can't go where I'm going to go next." Wendy and Lisa stared at him in shock. After years of creative partnership, after building the sound that defined an era, Prince was firing them. Over dinner, the revolution was over, and Prince had just killed it himself. If this story matters to you, subscribe now so you won't miss the continuing chapters. Rewind to 1983, and the revolution didn't yet exist, in the form the world would come to know. Prince had been cycling through musicians for years, searching for something he couldn't quite articulate. He needed more than backing musicians. He needed collaborators who could translate the sounds in his head into reality while he stood at the center of his expanding vision. But the real transformation began when Wendy Melvoin walked into rehearsals in 1983. She was 20 years old, a guitarist from Los Angeles with serious musical pedigree. Her father, Mike Melvoin, had been part of the legendary Wrecking Crew, the studio musicians who had shaped the sound of 60s pop. Wendy brought something Prince hadn't encountered before. She wasn't intimidated by him. When he played a riff, she'd respond with her own ideas. When he suggested a direction, she'd offer alternatives. And she came as a package deal with Lisa Coleman, a keyboard player who had been working with Prince since 1980. Wendy and Lisa had been making music together since childhood, their creative partnership so intuitive they could finish each other's musical phrases. Prince watched them work together during those early rehearsals and recognized something valuable. They brought classical training, Stravinsky, Ravel, Scarlatti, influences that could elevate his funk and rock foundations into something more sophisticated. Lisa's atmospheric keyboard work created sonic landscapes, while Wendy's guitar playing added both power and nuance. More importantly, they pushed back, not with ego or defiance, but with genuine artistic conviction. For someone as controlling as Prince, this should have been unbearable. Instead, he found it exhilarating. The creation of Purple Rain in 1983 and early 1984 brought the revolution into full formation. BrownMark had joined on bass after Andre Simone's departure, bringing a funk-heavy groove that anchored the band's rhythmic foundation. The album sold over 13 million copies in the United States alone. The accompanying film turned Prince into a global icon. And the revolution was at the center of it all, visible in every frame, audible in every song. But success at that scale creates its own pressures. Bobby Z later described the tour as a period when Prince's relationship with repetition began to fracture. They played the same songs in nearly the same order every night, and while audiences were ecstatic, Prince was bored. He needed novelty, needed to chase the next creative high. The success that should have validated their approach instead made him restless. The revolution had helped him reach the summit, and now that he stood there, he wanted to climb a different mountain entirely. The Around the World in a Day album arrived in 1985, and its psychedelic textures signaled Prince's desire to move away from the rock-funk formula that had made Purple Rain so successful. Wendy and Lisa contributed significantly to songs like Raspberry Beret and Paisley Park, their melodic sensibilities shaping the album's dreamlike atmosphere. Critics praised the artistic growth. Fans were more divided. Some loved the evolution. Others wanted more Purple Rain. Prince didn't care about either reaction. He was already thinking 3 projects ahead, his mind racing toward sounds that didn't yet exist. During the sessions for what would become the Parade album in 1986, tensions that had been manageable began to intensify. Prince's working method had always been demanding, but now it became more erratic. He would call musicians to the studio at odd hours, work for 18 hours straight, then disappear for days. The Parade album was intended as the soundtrack for his film Under the Cherry Moon, and Prince had specific cinematic visions that required the music to serve narrative purposes. The Revolution members contributed significantly. Mountains emerged from a jam session. Kiss originally belonged to a group project before Prince reclaimed it. But the collaborative spirit was shifting. Wendy and Lisa experienced similar frustrations, but from a different angle. They wanted more recognition for their contributions, not from ego, but from artistic identity. When journalists interviewed the band, Prince dominated the coverage. When credits appeared on albums, Prince's name was everywhere: producer, writer, arranger, performer. The Revolution members received their instrumental credits, but the public narrative positioned them as supporting players in Prince's singular genius story, which was partially true. Prince was the driving force, the visionary, the leader, but it wasn't the complete truth, and that gap between reality and perception began to grate. During sound checks, Prince would sometimes work with the new additions while the Revolution waited, literally sidelined during their own tour. The original members felt their importance diminishing, their roles becoming less central to Prince's evolving vision. Susan Rogers, Prince's sound engineer during this period, watched the dynamics from her position in the studio. She saw how Prince was changing, becoming more interested in solo experiments and alter ego projects like Camille, where he manipulated his vocals through pitch shifting to create a new persona. These weren't Revolution projects. These were Prince exploring territories where the band couldn't follow, not because they lacked ability, but because the creative direction was fundamentally solitary. Rogers understood that Prince was outgrowing the band concept itself, that his artistic evolution was moving towards something more individualistic and experimental. Then Prince scrapped it, not gradually or with extensive consultation, but decisively. The Dream Factory material was reorganized, with some songs moved to what would become the Sign of the Times double album, others shelved entirely, and the collaborative concept abandoned. To the band members, this felt like betrayal. They had invested time and creativity into something Prince had encouraged, only to have him unilaterally change direction. The message, intended or not, was clear. Prince retained absolute authority over creative decisions, and their input was advisory at best. By the time Wendy and Lisa arrived at Prince's Beverly Hills home on October 7, 1986, they suspected something was wrong but couldn't have anticipated the totality of what was coming. The Parade tour had ended recently, and there were discussions about future projects, new albums, the next phase of their collective journey. Prince had been distant, but he was often distant. His creative process involved periods of intense collaboration, followed by solitary reflection. This seemed like it might be one of those transitional moments. The house was quiet when they entered, not the usual buzz of activity that surrounded Prince. He greeted them politely but without warmth, and they sat down to eat in an atmosphere that felt heavy, with unspoken tension. Wendy later described trying to make conversation about the tour, about ideas for new material, anything to break the uncomfortable silence. Prince responded with minimal words, his body language closed off in a way they'd rarely seen. Then he spoke the sentence that would end their professional partnership. "I know that you guys can't go where I'm going to go next." The phrasing was interesting, not, "I don't want you to come with me," but rather positioning their departure as inevitable, something beyond anyone's control. He explained that his artistic vision was evolving in directions that required different collaborators, or perhaps no collaborators at all. He mentioned wanting to explore more provocative stage presentations, more experimental sounds, approaches that he believed wouldn't suit their aesthetic or comfort levels. Wendy and Lisa asked for clarification, for specifics about what had changed or what they had done wrong. Prince insisted it wasn't about fault. They had been extraordinary, their contributions invaluable, but creative partnerships had natural endpoints. This was that endpoint. The conversation was brief. Prince had made his decision and there was nothing to negotiate. They left the house in a state of shock, not quite believing what had just happened. Years of collaboration, of helping build one of the most successful acts in music history, had been terminated over dinner in less than an hour. The other Revolution members learned of their dismissal through different channels. Bobby Z received a phone call, Prince's voice on the line explaining with similar brevity that the band was being dissolved. He was thanked for his service, told his contributions had been essential, and informed that this chapter was closing. The call lasted minutes. After nearly a decade of working together, of building something extraordinary from Minneapolis roots, Bobby Z was being let go with the emotional warmth of a corporate downsizing. BrownMark's departure was more complicated. Some accounts suggest he quit in solidarity with Wendy and Lisa when he learned of their firing. Other versions indicate Prince told him the band was being restructured and his services were no longer required. The truth likely involves elements of both. BrownMark saw what was happening, recognized the creative partnership was over regardless of individual decisions, and chose to step away from a situation that had become untenable. He later wrote about feeling both relieved and devastated, freed from an increasingly difficult working relationship, but mourning the loss of something that had defined his artistic identity. Dr. Fink's situation was ambiguous. He was offered the possibility of continuing with Prince in some capacity, not as part of the Revolution, but as a session musician for future projects. Whether this constituted being fired or simply a renegotiation of terms depended on perspective. Fink initially considered staying, but ultimately decided the arrangement wouldn't work. Being part of the Revolution had meaning. Being a hired hand for Prince's solo projects felt like a demotion, regardless of how it was framed. Within 10 days, the band that had created Purple Rain, that had helped define the sound of the 1980s, was completely dismantled. Prince announced publicly that he was pursuing new artistic directions. Music journalists speculated about the reasons. Creative differences was the standard explanation, though what those differences entailed remained vague. Fans were stunned. The Revolution had seemed indivisible from Prince's success. The idea that he would continue without them felt incomprehensible. Prince moved quickly to establish his post-Revolution identity. The Sign of the Times album, released in 1987, was explicitly a solo work, even though it incorporated some material that had involved Revolution members during its development. Prince played most instruments himself, hired session musicians for specific needs, and maintained complete creative control. The album was a critical triumph, praised for its artistic ambition and sonic diversity. Songs like Sign of the Times address social issues with a directness Prince had rarely attempted. If I Was Your Girlfriend explored gender and intimacy through complex emotional landscapes. The album demonstrated that Prince didn't need the Revolution to create significant work, but something had been lost, even as other things were gained. The creative tension that had made Purple Rain special, the push and pull between Prince's vision and his collaborators' contributions, was absent. Sign of the Times was fully realized according to one person's artistic sensibility, which made it coherent but also somewhat insular. Music critics noted the album's brilliance while occasionally observing that certain songs might have benefited from the kind of organic development that came from band interaction. The Revolution members, meanwhile, faced the challenge of building careers outside Prince's shadow. Wendy and Lisa formed a duo under their first names, releasing their self-titled debut album in 1987. The record showcased their pop sensibilities and harmonic sophistication, receiving positive reviews and moderate commercial success. They continued releasing albums throughout the late 1980s and 1990s, developing a devoted following. More lucratively and sustainably, they moved into composing for television and film, creating scores for series like Heroes and Nurse Jackie. This work utilized their collaborative strengths and classical training, providing creative satisfaction and financial stability that touring and recording as independent artists couldn't match. What drove Prince to destroy the revolution at the peak of their success? The question haunted fans and music historians, generating theories that ranged from psychological analysis to practical career management. The most credible explanations weren't mutually exclusive. Multiple factors likely combined to push Prince toward the decision. Control was certainly central. Prince's entire career had been defined by his fight for creative autonomy. His battles with Warner Bros. Over ownership of his master recordings, his eventual name change to an unpronounceable symbol to escape contractual obligations. These weren't the actions of someone comfortable sharing power. The revolution, by virtue of being genuinely collaborative, required Prince to share creative space. Even when he maintained final approval, the process involved input and discussion. For someone whose creative process involved translating internal visions directly into recorded reality, collaboration could feel like dilution rather than enhancement. The artistic direction Prince wanted to explore in the late 1980s genuinely didn't align well with the revolution's strengths. The funk rock pop fusion that had defined their work together was something Prince wanted to move beyond. He was interested in more stripped-down sounds, more electronic experimentation, more provocative and less commercially calculated material. The Black Album, recorded in 1987 and initially pressed before Prince withdrew it from release, contained dark, sexually explicit material that bore no resemblance to Purple Rain. Whether the revolution could have or would have wanted to participate in that creative direction is questionable. In retrospect, the dissolution looks almost inevitable, not because the collaboration had failed. On the contrary, it had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, but precisely because it had succeeded so completely, it had achieved everything it was capable of achieving. Purple Rain was a peak that couldn't be surpassed, only repeated or departed from. Prince chose departure with all the costs and possibilities that choice entailed. The relationship between Prince and his former Revolution bandmates thawed gradually over the years, though it never fully returned to the earlier warmth. In the 2000s, occasional communications occurred. Emails where Prince would reach out about specific projects, inquiries about collaborating on particular songs. These contacts were sporadic and never led to full-scale reunions, but they indicated that Prince's feelings toward his former partners had evolved from whatever cold certainty drove the 1986 firings towards something more reflective and generous. Wendy and Lisa spoke in interviews about receiving messages from Prince, where he acknowledged their contributions more explicitly than he had during their working years. These weren't quite apologies. Prince didn't apologize. That wasn't his emotional vocabulary. But they were recognition that what they had built together had been special and valuable. In the controlled emotional language Prince used, this represented significant movement. The Revolution members reunited for memorial events after Prince's death on April 21, 2016, performing together for the first time in decades at tribute concerts. These performances were emotionally overwhelming for both the musicians and audiences. Hearing Wendy's guitar and Lisa's keyboards alongside Bobby Z's drums and BrownMark's bass playing Purple Rain and Let's Go Crazy without the man who had written those songs, the absence was overwhelming. But there was also something healing about the experience, a recognition that what they had created together transcended the complications of how it had ended. In interviews after Prince's death, the Revolution members spoke with remarkable lack of bitterness. They acknowledged the difficulty of the breakup, the hurt feelings and confusion, but they also expressed gratitude for having been part of something extraordinary. Bobby Z noted that working with Prince had been the greatest privilege of his professional life, Even with all its challenges, Wendy and Lisa emphasized that Prince had believed in them when few others would have, that he'd given them opportunities to develop as artists that they wouldn't have found elsewhere. This generosity of perspective reflected both the passage of time and a mature understanding of creative collaboration's complex nature. Partnerships that produce significant art are rarely comfortable or easy. The friction that generates creative sparks is the same friction that eventually causes relationships to ignite and burn out. The revolution had been volatile and brilliant, unsustainable and extraordinary, exactly the kind of artistic configuration that creates masterpieces before falling apart. Prince's solo career after the revolution proved his critics wrong in many ways. He demonstrated that he could create meaningful work without collaborators, that his vision could sustain entire albums and tours through pure individual force of will. Albums like Sign of the Times, Love Sexy, and even commercial misfires like Graffiti Bridge showed an artist refusing to be constrained by expectations or market demands. His productivity remained astonishing. He continued writing and recording constantly, filling the vault at Paisley Park with thousands of unreleased songs that documented his restless creativity. But there's also truth in the observation that Prince never quite recaptured the cultural impact of the Purple Rain era. Part of that was inevitable. Capturing lightning in a bottle twice is nearly impossible, and the music industry landscape changed dramatically between the mid-1980s and subsequent decades. Part of it, though, may have been the loss of collaborative friction. When Prince worked entirely alone or only with hired musicians who functioned as executors of his vision rather than creative partners, something was missing from the equation. Not better or worse necessarily, but different. The Wendy and Lisa contributions, the Bobby Z rhythmic foundations, the BrownMark grooves, these weren't just interchangeable parts. They were voices in a conversation, and when the conversation became a monologue, the dynamic changed. Was Prince right to fire the revolution? The question assumes a single answer exists, that artistic decisions can be evaluated as correct or incorrect based on outcome. But creative choices don't work that way. Prince made the decision that felt necessary for his continued artistic evolution. The revolution members experienced that decision as painful and unfair, while also eventually acknowledging that staying together might have led to different problems: stagnation, resentment, creative deadlock. What's undeniable is that both Prince and the revolution created significant work after the breakup. Prince's solo albums demonstrated his ability to function as a complete artistic entity. Wendy and Lisa's duo work in television composing proved they could thrive outside Prince's shadow. Bobby Z, BrownMark, and Dr. Fink found their own paths forward. The dissolution didn't destroy anyone's creative capacity. It redirected it into different channels. The legacy of the revolution extends beyond the 4 years they officially existed, in the handful of albums they recorded together. They proved that a multiracial, gender-diverse band could dominate mainstream pop music in the 1980s, a decade not particularly known for its progressiveness. They demonstrated that virtuosity and pop accessibility weren't mutually exclusive, that you could create music that was both commercially successful and artistically ambitious. And they showed what could happen when genuinely talented musicians aligned around a singular vision while contributing their own creative voices. Music historians continue debating the revolution's place in Prince's career. Some argue that Purple Rain represents his artistic peak and that everything afterward, while often excellent, existed in that album's shadow. Others contend that Prince's later work showed greater artistic growth precisely because he freed himself from collaborative compromise. Both perspectives contain truth. What can't be debated is that the 3 years when the revolution was fully functional, from 1983's formation through 1986's dissolution, produced some of the most significant popular music of the decade. The younger musicians who came up in Prince's later bands never quite filled the space the revolution had occupied. Talented as they were, and Prince continued working with extraordinary musicians throughout his career, they functioned in a different capacity. They were his band rather than a band he was part of. That distinction mattered. The revolution had been genuinely collaborative in ways that later configurations weren't. And while that collaboration eventually became unsustainable for Prince, it had also been the source of unique creative magic. On that October evening in 1986, when Prince fired Wendy and Lisa over dinner, he was following his artistic instincts toward an uncertain future. He believed he needed to be alone to fully realize his vision, to push into territories where collaborators couldn't follow. History suggests his instinct was partially correct. He did create remarkable work in the years that followed, work that likely wouldn't have emerged if he'd remained with the revolution. But history also shows that something irreplaceable was lost. The particular alchemy that occurred when those specific musicians worked together couldn't be reproduced or replaced. The revolution was lightning in a bottle, the right people at the right time creating the right music for that specific cultural moment. Prince recognized that and used it brilliantly. When he felt it had served its purpose, he ended it definitively. The pain that ending caused to the musicians who were dismissed, to fans who loved the band, perhaps even to Prince himself in quieter moments, was real. But the music remained, documenting a period when collaboration and individual genius combined to create something neither could have achieved alone. 38 years after that dinner in Beverly Hills, the revolution's recordings continue finding new audiences. Young musicians discover Purple Rain and realize it's not just 80s nostalgia, but genuinely innovative music that still sounds vital. Wendy's guitar work influences new generations of players. Lisa's keyboard approaches appear in contemporary pop production. Bobby Z's drumming remains a masterclass in tasteful, powerful rhythmic support. The impact extends beyond direct musical influence. The model of creative partnership they represented, with all its brilliance and ultimate dysfunction, continues informing how we think about collaboration in popular music. Prince never publicly expressed regret about firing the revolution. That wasn't his way. He moved forward, always forward, toward the next project and the next creative challenge. But in those occasional emails to Wendy and Lisa, in the moments when he acknowledged their contributions more generously than he had during their working years, there were hints of reflection. Not regret necessarily, but recognition that what they had built together mattered, that it had been more than just a career phase or commercial strategy. It had been real, and its reality continued reverberating long after the band itself had dissolved. The story of the revolution is ultimately a story about the costs of artistic vision. To create something extraordinary often requires difficult choices, endings that hurt, paths not taken. Prince chose his vision over his partnerships, his solo exploration over collaborative comfort. The revolution members chose their dignity and artistic identities over remaining in subordinate roles. Everyone lost something. Everyone gained something. And the music that emerged from both the collaboration and its dissolution became part of the permanent soundtrack of our cultural memory. That's the paradox at the heart of this story. The firing that seemed to destroy something actually preserved it in amber, freezing the revolution at the moment of their greatest achievement. If they had continued, gradually declining through diminishing returns and increasing resentment, the legacy would be different. Instead, they exist forever as they were in 1984 through 1986, young, brilliant, creating masterpieces, the band that made Purple Rain before Prince decided he needed to reign alone.